Lucas's own parents took him to court immediately after his grandfather had been laid to rest. The accusation was not a misunderstanding but a charge severe enough to destroy both his career and his reputation, manipulating an elderly man to seize his inheritance. The courtroom in Flagstaff that winter morning felt heavy, as if the cold air had been compressed into something suffocating. Every seat was filled. Reporters crowded the aisles. Camera flashes went off relentlessly, hunting for the slightest change in Lucas Warren's expression. In the public eye, he was merely a young prosecutor dragged into a scandalous inheritance lawsuit by his own parents, a man forced into a defensive position, vulnerable and suspect. But Lucas said nothing. He stood straight behind the defendant's table, his back rigid, his hands resting lightly on the cold wooden surface. His face was unnervingly calm. No anger. No panic. No attempt to explain himself. His silence unsettled the entire room, as though something crucial was being deliberately held back. On the plaintiff's side, Michael and Evelyn Warren sat beside their private attorney. Michael's arms were crossed, his gaze sharp and unforgiving, like a father who had not come to mourn but to reclaim what he believed had been stolen from him. Evelyn held her head high, her makeup flawless, her lips pressed together in pride. In her mind, the son she had abandoned years ago was nothing more than a minor obstacle on the path to a fortune worth millions of dollars. The judge asked Lucas to present his statement, and the courtroom held its breath. Lucas stepped forward, slowly and deliberately, calm and composed. He did not look at his parents first. He did not look at the press. He bent down, opened an old leather briefcase worn at the corners, and took out a single item, a diary. Its brown leather cover was aged, the pages carefully stitched together, the tears still visible like scars that had never fully healed. A murmur spread through the courtroom. The plaintiff's lawyer frowned. Evelyn narrowed her eyes. Michael suddenly clenched his hands, as if recognizing something familiar and terrifying at the same time. Lucas placed the diary on the evidence table. That was all. No defense. No tears. No pleas of innocence. In that moment, very few people realized that the young man so thoroughly underestimated by the room was not standing in a position of weakness at all. He had not come to beg for sympathy. He had come to let the truth speak for itself. And truth, once revealed, carries enough weight to bring down even the most confident of people. In the back row, a reporter whispered that this case would mark the end of Lucas Warren's career. But if they had looked more closely, they would have seen something else in his eyes. Not fear, but the steady resolve of someone who knew exactly what he was holding, and who knew that once that diary was read aloud, many masks would fall. No one in the courtroom truly knew who Lucas Warren was beyond the sensational headlines in the press. A young prosecutor. A son being sued by his own parents. A suspected heir. But his real story did not begin in that courtroom. It began many years earlier, in a place far quieter, far colder, and far more lonely. Lucas was born in Flagstaff, a highland town where pine forest winds blow year-round and winters seem endless. For many, it was a place to return to. For Lucas, it was the place where he was left behind. When he was still too young to understand what loss meant, his parents chose to leave. There were no arguments. No tears. Just a cold afternoon, a small suitcase, and a vague promise that they would come back. That promise was never kept. At the time, Michael Warren was at the height of his fame, surrounded by races, parties, and bright lights. He had no time for a child. Evelyn Warren was no different. Her television career was rising fast. Cameras did not wait for anyone, and neither did she wait for the responsibilities of motherhood. In their world, Lucas was an inconvenient mistake, an unnecessary detail that needed to be set aside. And so Lucas was sent to an old wooden house at the edge of town, where Henry Cole lived with his wife, Margaret. Henry was not an easy man to approach. He was strict, reserved, his gaze always seeming to weigh something deeper than what lay on the surface. The entire town knew him as a judge famous for an integrity so rigid it bordered on severity. No one knew how long he stood frozen when he saw his small grandson at the door, gripping a worn backpack with trembling hands. Margaret was different. She did not ask why. She did not accuse or complain. She simply knelt down and pulled Lucas into her arms, the familiar scent of flower and herbs wrapping around the shivering child. In that moment, something invisible shifted. Lucas was no longer a child who had been abandoned. He became someone chosen. The years that followed passed slowly. There was no glamour, no abundance. But there was presence. Henry taught Lucas how to sit still and think before speaking, taught him that every decision carries consequences. Margaret taught him how to tend the garden, how to wait patiently for a sprout to rise from cold soil. And more importantly, she taught him that love does not require conditions. Lucas grew up in that house, among quiet evenings and mist-covered mornings. He learned how to observe, how to listen, how to endure. No one in town knew that the quiet boy was silently gathering the very things that would one day bring an entire courtroom to silence. Trust, discipline, and a resolve forged through years of being underestimated. In the Flagstaff courtroom that day, as Lucas stood motionless beneath skeptical stares, that past stood with him. No one could see Henry Cole standing behind him in memory. No one could hear the calm voice from long ago whispering that the truth does not need to shout. It only needs to be placed where it belongs. And Lucas knew that the diary was exactly where that truth belonged. If silence had a shape, it would wear the face of Michael Warren. He always entered a room as if the world owed him an apology, shoulders squared, chin lifted, his gaze never lingering on anyone for too long, not even on his own son. In Lucas's memory, his father had never bent down to meet his eyes, never asked if he was cold, never asked what he needed. Michael Warren loved freedom, loved speed, loved the thrill of being admired, and in that kind of life, a child served no purpose. Evelyn Warren was different, yet exactly the same. She was not loud or coarse. She was sharp, calculating, and always knew where to stand so the light would fall just right. When Lucas was small, she would smooth his hair in front of the camera, a gentle smile perfectly crafted for television. But when the camera stopped rolling, that hand withdrew as if it had never touched him at all. In Evelyn's world, emotion was something that could be switched on and off according to the script. Lucas understood this far earlier than most people realized. The rare occasions when his parents appeared in his life all carried the same feeling. They did not come to visit. They stopped by. Like busy guests making a brief appearance, bringing with them unfamiliar perfume and empty pleasantries. Michael asked about school performance the way one reviews an investment. Evelyn asked about appearance and manners, as if assessing an unfinished product. And then they disappeared, always the same way. On quiet evenings in the wooden house, Lucas would sit by the window, watching the road that led into town, waiting. Not because he hoped they would come, but because part of him wanted certainty that they would not. Each time the road remained empty it hurt, and yet it was a relief. At least the truth remained consistent. Henry Cole saw everything. He never spoke ill of his son. He did not excuse him. He did not defend him. But during long chess games, when Lucas hesitated over a move, Henry would offer only one short sentence. Some people do not play to win. They play to satisfy themselves. You must learn to tell the difference. Margaret quietly filled in the remaining gaps. She set an extra plate on the dinner table even when she knew Lucas would eat alone. She kept the hallway light on every night. She asked little, demanded nothing. She was present, steady and enduring, like a promise that did not need to be spoken. Lucas grew up between two opposing worlds. On one side were his parents, dazzling yet hollow. On the other were his grandparents, strict yet complete. That contrast sharpened in him a rare instinct. He learned to see past words to motives, to recognize when affection was being used as a tool. So many years later, in the courtroom, when Michael and Evelyn sat across from him with the confidence of those who believed blood alone was an unbreakable shield, Lucas was not surprised. He had seen their true nature long ago. What they misjudged was this: they had never realized that the child they left behind had learned to observe them more closely than anyone else. And that observation, over time, had become power. Henry and Margaret Cole's wooden house stood apart from the town, tucked beneath a line of old pine trees that whispered constantly in the wind. It was not large, not new, but it held something Lucas had never had before: stability. On his first day inside, the boy stood frozen at the doorway for a long time, as if afraid that the moment he stepped in, everything might disappear. Henry did not hug him. He simply nodded, his stern gaze sweeping Lucas from head to toe, then said a single, concise sentence. "From today on you live here. No promises. No embellishment." Yet there was something in that voice so certain it required no further explanation. Margaret was different. She placed a hand on Lucas's back, light but warm. That hand guided him into the kitchen, where the scent of steaming soup filled the air. No one asked if he was afraid. No one asked if he missed his parents. She simply pulled out a chair, set a bowl of soup in front of him, and said, "Eat, it is cold outside." For the first time in his life, Lucas felt what it was like to be cared for without conditions. The days that followed moved slowly. Henry established rules. Clear schedules. Each task in its place. No complaining. No blaming. Lucas was awkward at first, but he soon understood something important. Those rules were not meant to control him. They were meant to protect him, to protect an order he had never been allowed to have. In the evenings, Henry would sit by the fireplace reading. Lucas sat across from him, doing homework or simply watching in silence. Few words were exchanged, but that silence was not heavy. It was nothing like the cold, hollow silence of the rooms where his parents had once lived. Here, silence was a form of trust. Margaret was present in her own quiet way. She rose early, tended the garden, cooked meals, and mended Lucas's clothes without ever mentioning her effort. Whenever he coughed or woke restless from nightmares, she would place another blanket over him and sit by the bed until his breathing steadied again. She never asked what he had dreamed. She understood that some fears need time to dissolve on their own. Lucas gradually realized something essential. His grandparents did not replace his parents. They chose him. In Henry and Margaret's world, he was not a burden. He was a responsibility they willingly accepted. And it was that willingness that made everything different. One afternoon, Lucas asked Henry a very quiet question: "Why did you take me in?" Henry looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing each word. Then he said, "When adults run away, someone has to stay." That answer carved itself into Lucas's memory, not as comfort, but as a principle to live by. Many years later, standing before the courtroom, Lucas remembered that wooden house. He remembered the feeling of being allowed to stay, of being chosen. And he understood that it was that place that shaped who he became, not through eloquent lessons, but through a silent presence that never once walked away. Lucas's first lessons did not come from books. They came from mist-covered mornings, when Henry Cole set a chessboard between them and said nothing at all. The pieces felt cold beneath Lucas's fingers. There was no clock ticking. No urging. Only Henry's stern gaze and a silence that forced the person across the board to think. Henry did not teach Lucas how to win. He taught him how to wait. Every wrong move was left as it was, not corrected, not scolded. At the end of each game, Henry asked only one question: "What did you see?" And Lucas learned that mistakes were not frightening. What was frightening was failing to recognize where you had gone wrong. After the chessboard came evenings spent reading old law books. Henry did not offer long explanations. He read through a case, paused, and then asked Lucas whether the ruling was fair. There was no single correct answer. Only reasoning. Gradually, Lucas came to understand that justice is not emotion. It is responsibility, a heavy responsibility, sometimes lonely, but one that cannot be avoided. Margaret taught different lessons. She did not speak about law. She spoke about people. In the garden behind the house, she showed Lucas how to plant and tend to living things. No plant grows quickly. No plant obeys commands. She told him that you cannot pull a sprout to make it grow taller. You can only care for it, and then wait. Love works the same way. Force only breaks the roots. There were afternoons when Lucas came home with his eyes darkened by a cruel remark at school. Margaret did not ask for details. She placed a warm cup of tea in front of him. She sat down. She stayed. That presence taught Lucas that not every pain needs advice. Some pains only need not to be abandoned one more time. Day by day, Lucas absorbed these lessons the way dry earth absorbs water. Without display. Without haste. But with endurance. He learned to tell right from wrong without raising his voice. He learned to remain calm when others lost control. He learned that real power does not lie in speaking louder, but in standing firmer. Many years later, when he faced skeptical eyes in the courtroom, Lucas did not tremble. Because from very early on, he had been taught one essential truth. Justice does not need to be defended with anger. It needs to be upheld with discipline and compassion. Despite being surrounded by that rare sense of stability, there was still an emptiness inside Lucas that nothing could fully fill. It was not loud. It did not erupt. It smoldered quietly, seeping into the most ordinary moments. A question that repeated itself, never spoken, yet never gone. Why did they not stay? Lucas did not ask this of anyone. Not Henry. Not Margaret. He learned to keep that question to himself, like a carefully sealed crack. But every time the school held a parents' day, every time he saw classmates being picked up by their mothers and fathers, that emptiness stirred, reminding him that a part of his life had been left behind. One winter evening, as wind battered the windows and the fireplace burned low, Lucas sat across from Henry after a long chess game. He hesitated for a long time before speaking. His voice was so small it nearly dissolved into the sound of crackling wood. "Did I do something wrong?" Henry did not answer immediately. He stared at the chessboard for a long moment, as if weighing the final move of a game that had lasted many years. Then he looked up, his gaze steady and deep. "No. Adults sometimes choose the path that is easiest for them, not the path that is right for the child." The words did not comfort him. But they were honest. And it was that honesty that allowed Lucas, for the first time, to breathe out. Margaret stood in the doorway, listening. She did not interrupt. She only stepped closer and placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder. That hand trembled ever so slightly. Not from the cold, but because she understood that some wounds are not meant to be healed, only to be lived with. From that day on, Lucas stopped waiting. He no longer watched the road leading into town each afternoon. He no longer imagined belated reunions. Instead, he began to observe the world as it was. Unfair. Ungentle. But clear. The pain did not disappear. It changed shape. From an open wound, it became a quiet drive. Lucas studied harder. Spoke less. Thought more. He understood that some questions would never have satisfying answers, and that growing up is not about finding those answers, but about continuing forward without them. Many years later, when his parents stood before him in the courtroom, Lucas did not search for recognition in their eyes. He had moved beyond that stage long ago. What he sought now was not an apology, but the truth. And he knew that truth, even when it arrives late, is still worth facing. Lucas was 15 when his biological parents returned. Without warning. Without preparation. One early autumn afternoon, a sleek black car pulled up in front of the familiar wooden house, shattering the quiet rhythm that had existed for so many years. Lucas looked out the window and recognized them instantly. Not by their faces, but by the chill that ran down his spine, a sensation that had been dormant for far too long and had suddenly awakened. Michael stepped out first. An expensive coat. A gleaming watch. A confident stride, as if he had never left. Evelyn followed, sunglasses covering half her face, a polite smile already in place like a mask. They stood on the porch, looking around, assessing. Not searching for memories, but estimating value. Henry opened the door. He was not surprised. There was no warm greeting. He simply nodded, his expression calm but alert. Michael smiled, his voice friendly to the point of straying. "It has been a long time, Dad." As if the years of abandoning his son were nothing more than an extended trip. Lucas stood behind them, watching in silence. He did not step forward. He did not retreat. Questions echoed in his mind, but his heart felt strangely empty. Not happy. Not angry. Just an invisible distance that had grown too solid to be disturbed. Evelyn moved closer to Lucas and held out her hand, her voice gentle. You have grown so much. Her eyes flicked quickly from his face to his clothes and shoes, a discreet inspection. Lucas shook her hand, polite, composed, as one would with a stranger. That moment made Evelyn pause. Only for an instant. But it was enough for her to realize that the child she had once left behind was no longer waiting for her. The conversation in the living room moved quickly. Questions about school, grades, future plans. Michael spoke at length about new projects, investment opportunities, powerful connections. Lucas listened and understood even before they said it outright. This return had nothing to do with affection. It had everything to do with money. Henry remained silent throughout. He observed every gesture, every glance. When Michael mentioned the need for a temporary loan, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Margaret lightly squeezed Lucas's hand under the table, a wordless reminder. Lucas looked at his parents, and saw clearly what years earlier he had been too young to name. They had not come back for him. They had come back for what this family possessed. And in that moment, a final door inside Lucas closed. Without noise. Without pain. Simply, decisively. He understood that their appearance was not the beginning of reconciliation. It was the first sign of an inevitable confrontation. The return of Michael and Evelyn did not stop at polite, hollow visits. Just a few weeks later, Lucas realized they had begun expanding their influence within the family, like patient hunters probing for the weakest link. And that link was not him. It was Daniel, a cousin who lived in a neighboring town. Daniel was a few years younger than Lucas, gentle, trusting, and constantly hungry for approval. When Michael called him, his voice was unusually warm. Compliments flowed easily, along with stories of success and carefully painted visions of the future. Daniel listened, his heart racing at the feeling of being noticed for the first time by someone like Michael. Lucas watched everything from a distance. He did not intervene immediately. He did not expose them. He observed, the way Henry had taught him to study a chessboard before moving a piece. He saw Daniel begin to spend more money. He heard him talk about vague plans, undefined business opportunities. He noticed how Daniel's eyes lit up whenever he mentioned his famous uncle. One evening, Lucas went to see Daniel. He did not accuse him. He did not issue harsh warnings. He asked only a few simple questions. Daniel smiled and said Lucas was worrying too much. Michael had promised to help. Evelyn had introduced valuable connections. Everything was legal. Everything was safe. Lucas listened and understood that advice at that moment would only draw Daniel in deeper. A few days later, the truth began to surface. Daniel had signed as a guarantor for a loan he could not afford. When the bank called, Michael had vanished. Evelyn did not answer her phone. Daniel sat in Lucas's kitchen, his hands shaking, his voice breaking with fear. He could not understand where he had gone wrong. He only wanted to believe that family would not harm one another. Lucas offered no reproach. He made tea and pulled out a chair for Daniel to sit. In that moment, he saw himself from many years earlier, a child who had believed that blood was a kind of guarantee. And he understood that this was not a personal mistake. It was a pattern. Henry watched in silence. His gaze darkened, not with anger, but with deep disappointment. He understood that his son had never changed. Only the target had. Once it was Lucas. Now, it was others. That night, Lucas stood alone on the porch, looking out at the dark pine forest moving in the wind. He had no doubts left. His parents' return was not random. It was the opening move in a carefully calculated series of actions. And this time, Lucas knew he could not simply stand by. Because if he stayed silent, more people would be pulled in. And he had learned all too well that the cost of silence is always higher than it seems. The tension in the wooden house did not explode at once. It accumulated quietly, like a thin sheet of ice spreading across a lake before a strong wind. Lucas felt it in every meal that grew more silent than usual, in the worry that lingered in Margaret's eyes, in the long pauses of Henry each time the phone rang, and then went dead without a word. The confrontation came on a grey afternoon. Michael and Evelyn arrived without warning, this time without polite smiles. Michael's voice was sharper, his insinuations about family responsibility and parental entitlement to the grandparents' assets no longer hidden. Evelyn stood beside him, her gaze cold, reinforcing his words with remarks that sounded gentle but pressed just as hard. Lucas instinctively stepped in front of Margaret. For the first time, he spoke. Not loudly. Not angrily. But every word was clear. This is not your money. And Daniel is not a tool for you to use. The sentence landed like a spark. Michael slammed his hand on the table. His anger spilled out unchecked. He accused Henry of manipulating Lucas, of teaching him to turn his back on his own parents. The words were sharp as blades. Margaret tried to speak, but her voice trembled. She stood up, her face draining of color, one hand pressed to her chest. The next moment happened too fast. Margaret collapsed. The chair tipped backward. A dry, brutal sound echoed through the room. Lucas rushed forward, calling her name, his voice breaking. Henry dropped to his knees beside his wife, his hands shaking in a way Lucas had never seen before. Michael stood frozen, his expression wavering for a brief second, then he turned away. Evelyn stepped back, lips pressed tight, as if it were all nothing more than an unfortunate accident. The ambulance arrived, but it was too late. Margaret passed away in the hospital, without time to say another word. The waiting room was cold, thick with the smell of disinfectant. Henry sat motionless, his eyes empty. Lucas stood by the window, watching the sky darken, feeling as though a part of the world had just collapsed. Michael and Evelyn did not stay. They left in silence, without an apology, without a backward glance. That absence weighed heavier than any accusation. It carved itself into Lucas's memory that even in the moment of greatest loss, they still chose themselves first. That night, Lucas sat alone in the kitchen, Margaret's chair standing empty. The pain did not erupt. It pressed down, crushed inward, forcing him to slow his breathing just to remain upright. And within that pain, something else took shape. Not hatred, but a cold clarity. Lucas understood that from this moment on, everything had crossed the line. What his parents had caused was no longer personal harm. It had become an irreversible consequence. And he knew that the road ahead would no longer allow him to turn back. Margaret's funeral took place on a morning heavy with fog. The small church at the edge of town was filled, familiar faces from Flagstaff sitting quietly beside one another, speaking more through glances than through words. Margaret Cole had lived a simple life, yet her absence left a void the entire town could feel. Lucas stood in the front row beside Henry. His shoulders were weighed down, as if in just a few days' time had taken more from him than a lifetime of work ever had. His hands were clenched tight, knuckles pale, yet his eyes still struggled to hold their familiar composure. Lucas looked at him and understood that some kinds of pain cannot be shared. They can only be carried. The casket was lowered into the ground. The sound of earth falling onto the wooden lid landed in steady beats, each one striking straight into the chest. Lucas did not cry. Not because he did not hurt, but because the pain was too vast to spill into tears. In his mind, small images surfaced. A hand placing an extra blanket each night. A plate always set aside. Afternoons spent in the garden. All simple. All gone. What drew the most attention was not who was present, but who was not. Michael and Evelyn did not come. No flowers. No wreath. Not a single message. The news spread quickly through the small town, and every look directed at Lucas carried sympathy mixed with anger on his behalf. Henry said nothing. He stood upright, as if refusing to let that absence knock him down one more time. After the funeral, the wooden house grew uncomfortably quiet. No more soft footsteps from Margaret. No more scent of fresh bread. Each room seemed to hold on to a trace of her breath, making Lucas want to flee and yet unable to leave. Henry withdrew further. He spoke less. Sometimes he would sit for hours by the window, staring at the untended garden. One evening, Lucas heard Henry's dry, lingering cough from the study. He stood outside the door for a long time before knocking. Henry turned, his eyes tired, his voice still controlled. "I am fine." But Lucas knew it was only the habit of a man who had spent his entire life refusing to allow himself weakness. It was in that heavy silence that a resolve took shape. Lucas did not voice it. He did not announce it. But within him, something became clear. He would not allow what Margaret stood for to disappear. He would not allow kindness to be trampled. He would not allow justice to remain an abstract idea. The funeral closed one chapter of life. But it also opened a path Lucas had never imagined he would walk. A path that did not lead back to his biological family, but toward responsibility. And he knew that from that day on, every choice he made would carry the memory of the woman who taught him what it meant to stay. After the funeral, Henry Cole never returned to the courtroom. His retirement papers were signed in silence, with no farewell gathering, no speech. To the town of Flagstaff, it was the withdrawal of a symbol of justice. To Lucas, it was a clear sign that Margaret's death had taken away the final pillar keeping Henry upright. In the days that followed, Henry retreated into the wooden house. He woke later. He let go of habits he had maintained for decades. The neatly arranged legal files on the shelves were no longer opened. Lucas realized that for the first time in his life, the man who had always been in control was drifting into a void he did not know how to fill. Lucas became a support naturally, even though no one formally acknowledged it. He cooked, tended the garden, handled the tasks Margaret once took care of. Not out of obligation, but because he understood that if no one held the rhythm of life together, the house would collapse slowly and inevitably. Some evenings, Henry called Lucas into the study. Not to teach, just to sit together. They did not speak much. Occasionally, Henry shared small stories about Margaret, about the ways she had patiently drawn him out of his own rigidity. His voice grew heavier when he spoke of what had been missed. Lucas listened and realized that even the strongest people carry regrets that cannot be undone. One late night, Henry handed Lucas an old folder. No explanation. Lucas opened it and found verdicts, handwritten notes, arguments revised with care. On the final page, Henry had written a single line. "Justice is not a profession. It is a way of living." Lucas closed the folder, feeling as though he were holding an invisible inheritance, weighty and profound. From that moment, a thought began to take shape within him. At first it was vague, like a question he had not yet dared to name. But day by day, it grew clearer. He did not want only to understand justice. He wanted to practice it. Not to prove anything to his biological parents, but to carry forward what Henry and Margaret had built. Henry did not pressure him. When Lucas spoke of studying law, Henry simply looked at him for a long time. In that gaze there was concern, but also deep trust. "This path will be very lonely," Henry said slowly. Lucas nodded. He had been familiar with that truth from an early age. The decision was made in that wooden house, with no witnesses beyond the two of them. Yet it marked a quiet transfer. From someone raised by justice, Lucas began the journey of becoming someone who would carry it further. Lucas's journey into the study of law did not begin with confidence. It began with exhaustion. Early mornings when fog still blanketed the town. Long rides that carried him away from Flagstaff to lecture halls. Late nights returning home, his mind heavy with layered concepts, statutes, and case law. Lucas did not complain. He treated that harshness as an inevitable part of the path he had chosen. Money was tight. Lucas worked multiple jobs at once. Teaching assistant, library shifts, unnamed part-time work. He learned to balance coursework with responsibilities at home. Every weekend, he returned to the wooden house, caring for Henry, fixing fences, mowing the lawn, keeping things from slowly falling apart. Fatigue was constant, but quitting never was. Henry watched from a distance. He did not interfere. He did not guide every step. He simply left small notes on Lucas's desk whenever he came home. A quotation. a brief comment on a famous case. Sometimes just a single line underlined in a book. Those quiet reminders were enough for Lucas to know he was not walking alone, even though the road ahead was still long. There were nights when Lucas sat alone in the empty library, staring at shelves that towered above him. The feeling of being overwhelmed crept in. He wondered whether he was good enough, resilient enough, cold enough to enter a world where the smallest mistake could destroy another person's life. In those moments he thought of Margaret, of how she patiently waited for things to grow. And he kept reading. The pain of loss did not disappear during those years of study. It stayed with Lucas, becoming a quiet source of drive. Every statute he learned, every argument he wrote, carried the image of people harmed by irresponsibility and greed. Lucas did not study to win. He studied so he would not repeat what had broken his family. When he graduated, there was no grand celebration. Henry shook his hand, the grip firm and brief. "I am proud of you," he said. Nothing more was needed. For Lucas, that was enough. He stepped out of the lecture hall with a law degree in his hand, but what mattered more was within him. A resolve forged through exhaustion, loss, and discipline. Lucas understood that from this point forward, every decision he made would carry real weight. And he was ready to bear it. Henry Cole passed away on a quiet morning, without warning, without drama. Lucas found him seated in his familiar chair by the window, one hand resting on an old leather notebook, his gaze directed toward the garden where Margaret had once tended every bed of soil. There were no signs of panic. No struggle. Just a silent ending, true to the way he had lived. The wooden house sank into a thick, suffocating stillness. Lucas stood beside Henry for a long time without touching him, as if even the slightest movement might shatter the fragility of that moment. He understood that the most important chapter of his life had just closed. The last person who had stayed with him from beginning to end was now gone. Henry's funeral was simple. Few eulogies. No display. Those who had worked with him, been judged by him, or respected him for his integrity came quietly to pay their respects. Lucas stood before the grave with the feeling that he was burying not only a man, but an entire era of certainty and principle. After the funeral, Henry's lawyer met with Lucas. He spoke briefly and handed him a thick envelope and an old leather notebook, the diary. The lawyer said Henry wanted Lucas to read it only when he was ready, not sooner, not later. Lucas held the notebook, its weight heavy in his hands, as if it contained not just words, but everything that had never been spoken aloud. That night, Lucas sat alone in Henry's study. The desk lamp cast a pale yellow light over the worn leather cover. He opened the first page. The handwriting was familiar, firm and precise. Henry did not write about law. He wrote about people. About his disappointment in Michael. About the long silence that followed when he realized his son could not, or would not, take responsibility. The pages that followed were even heavier. Henry wrote about his decision to leave all of his assets to Lucas, not as a reward, but as protection. He feared that if the estate fell into the hands of those driven solely by self-interest, every value he and Margaret had preserved would be erased. Lucas closed the diary as dawn approached. His eyes were red, but no tears fell. He understood that Henry had left behind more than property. He had left a choice, a burden, and an absolute trust that Lucas would do what was right, even if the cost was facing his own biological family. Outside, the sunrise unfolded slowly. Lucas stood up, the diary in his hand, knowing that from this moment on, his life would enter a current he could not avoid. But this time, he was not walking alone. The values of Henry and Margaret were with him, carried in every page whose ink had not yet fully dried. Henry Cole's will was read in a small room at the law office, with no audience and no noise. Lucas sat upright, the journal resting on his lap like a silent reminder of what lay ahead. The lawyer read each clause in an even, neutral tone, yet every word carried an undeniable weight. All of Henry's assets, from the wooden house and the garden to the savings accumulated over many years, were transferred to Lucas, without conditions and without exceptions. Michael's share consisted of only one item, the journal. The atmosphere in the room shifted immediately. Michael sprang to his feet, his face flushed, scoffing as if it were a deliberate insult. Evelyn tightened her grip, her eyes darkening. She understood faster, far too fast. That journal was not merely paper and ink, it was an accusation. The moment they left the law office, Michael exploded. He accused Lucas of manipulating Henry, of exploiting his age and illness. Evelyn was colder. She spoke of family honor, of lawful inheritance, of the impossibility of allowing a child raised by others to seize everything. Every word was carefully chosen, as if prepared in advance for a long battle. Lucas did not argue. He had anticipated this from the moment he read the final lines of the journal. What surprised him was not the anger, but the speed. Just days later, a lawsuit was filed. The charges were written in the cold language of the law: undue influence over an elderly man, inheritance fraud, abuse of familial trust. The news spread quickly. A prosecutor sued by his own parents. Public opinion ignited, rushed comments, uninformed judgments. Lucas was temporarily suspended from his position pending investigation. He became the center of a story no one truly understood. Back in the wooden house, Lucas sat alone with the journal open before him. The pages had been torn and carefully stitched back together, like old wounds that had never fully healed. He understood that his parents wanted more than money. They wanted to erase Henry's judgment, to turn him into a confused old man and Lucas into a profiteer. But they had miscalculated one thing. Henry had not left the journal as a keepsake. He had left it as evidence. And Lucas, who had studied law not to protect himself, now had to use everything he knew to defend the truth. Outside, the storm of public opinion continued to grow. Inside, Lucas was terrifyingly calm. He knew this battle was no longer about property. It was the final confrontation between irreconcilable values, and this time, he had no intention of stepping back. The preliminary hearing took place on a bleak morning, the sky hanging low and heavy, mirroring the atmosphere inside the courtroom. Lucas entered with a composed demeanor, his dark suit causing him to blend into the cold lights above. Many watched him with suspicion, a young prosecutor sued by his own biological parents. In that narrative, he had already been cast as the betrayer before the court ever spoke. Michael sat upright, confident, as if he were the true victim. Evelyn beside him wore a carefully measured expression of grief, eyes reddened just enough to seem convincing. Their attorney presented a neat, coherent story: a frail old man, a nephew raised under his care, a journal allegedly exploited. Everything sounded reasonable, almost flawless. Then it was Lucas's turn. He did not rise immediately. He opened his leather briefcase, removed a thick file, and placed it on the table with a soft yet decisive sound. The judge's gaze lingered longer than usual. Lucas began in a low voice, not defending himself, not speaking of money or inheritance, but of time. He spoke of evenings when Henry was fully lucid, writing line after line in steady handwriting. He spoke of medical examinations thoroughly documented, proving Henry's mental clarity throughout the drafting of the will. He presented letters, receipts, calendar notes, each piece arranged into a logical chain that could not be broken. Then he paused. Lucas looked directly at Michael for a single second, long enough to expose the flicker of unease in the older man's eyes. He continued, no longer looking at the files. He read an excerpt from the journal, not the part about money, but the part about disappointment, about a son who appeared only when he needed something and disappeared once he had taken enough. The courtroom fell silent. Evelyn turned her face away. Michael clenched his hands until his knuckles turned white. Their lawyer stood to object, but his voice lacked conviction. The words in the journal were no longer mere emotion, they had become context, motive, and unvarnished truth. Lucas concluded with a single sentence, cold and precise. This is not an inheritance dispute. This is an attempt to erase the final voice of a man who chose to speak the truth. For the first time since the lawsuit began, the balance in the courtroom shifted, and those who had underestimated Lucas began to realize that he had never been the weaker party in this game. After the hearing, cracks began to form in Michael's confidence. He left the courtroom faster than he had entered, his steps heavy, the posture of a man certain of victory nowhere to be found. Evelyn followed behind him, her face drained of color, lips pressed tight as if trying to hold on to something slipping beyond her control. In the days that followed, the atmosphere shifted noticeably. The press stopped running hostile headlines about Lucas, and the questions began to change direction. Henry's journal was no longer portrayed as a tool of manipulation, but as the final voice of a father who had been abandoned. Public opinion turned slowly, yet decisively. Lucas chose deliberate silence. He gave no interviews, offered no explanations, launched no counterattacks. Each evening, he returned to the wooden house and reread the journal, not to search for more evidence, but to steady the one thing that mattered most. His purpose had never been to defeat his parents. It was to protect the truth Henry had written at the cost of his last remaining trust. On the other side, disorder began to surface. Michael's attorney requested additional time. Several witnesses asked to withdraw their statements. Small details in Michael's narrative no longer aligned. Evelyn stopped sleeping, doubt creeping into her thoughts, though it was already too late to turn back. One afternoon, Lucas received a notice from the court. The main trial would be moved up sooner than scheduled. The judge had seen enough. There was no reason to prolong a truth that was revealing itself. Lucas folded the letter and stood quietly by the window, the late sunlight washing over the garden where Henry once sat and wrote. He knew the storm was not over, but now he was no longer standing alone against the wind. The truth had begun to speak for itself, and once that happened, no one could stop it. The verdict day arrived faster than anyone had expected. The courtroom was full, yet unnaturally quiet, every gaze fixed on the judge's bench, where the truth was about to be named. Lucas sat upright, his hands folded neatly on the table, his expression so calm it unsettled many. Not because he was certain of victory, but because he was prepared to accept any outcome, as long as the truth was spoken. Michael and Evelyn sat across from him. Michael kept his head lowered, his shoulders weighed down. Evelyn could no longer maintain her composure, her hands trembling slightly, her eyes darting toward the door as if searching for an invisible escape. They were no longer people demanding what they believed was theirs. They were facing the consequences of their own actions. The judge delivered the ruling in a steady, deliberate voice, without ornament or drama, only facts placed back where they belong. The will was valid. The journal was admissible evidence. There was no manipulation, no fraud. The lawsuit was dismissed in its entirety. The room fell silent for several seconds, then a low murmur rippled through the air like a wave released after being held too long. Michael closed his eyes, as if finally accepting what he had spent so long avoiding. Evelyn turned away, lips pressed tight, saying nothing. When permitted, Lucas stood. He did not smile, did not nod in triumph. He simply bowed his head slightly to the judge, a small gesture carrying profound respect for justice and for the man who was no longer there to defend himself. As he left the courtroom, Lucas paused before a photograph on the wall, Henry in his judge's robe, his gaze firm yet warm. He stood there for a long moment, not to celebrate, but to close a painful chapter. Justice had spoken, and this time, it required nothing more from him. After the trial, Sedona slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. The red dust settled back onto the roads, the old pine trees stood quietly in the late afternoon sun, everything appearing unchanged, as if no storm of public scrutiny had ever swept through. But for Lucas, the world was no longer the same, not because he had won the case, but because he had walked the entire path that Henry and Grace had once laid before him. He returned to the wooden house one late afternoon, pale golden light spilling through the windows and resting on the old table where the journal lay neatly in place. Lucas opened it and turned to the final page, the familiar handwriting still steady and unshaken, just like Henry himself. This time, he read not to find strength, but to say goodbye. Outside, new shoots were pushing through the soil. Lucas had planted them himself after the trial ended, continuing a habit passed down to him. He understood now that justice was not the single moment of a gavel striking wood, but a series of choices made again and again, even when no one was watching. Michael and Evelyn left the town not long after, without apologies and without farewells, and Lucas no longer waited for either. He had learned that forgiveness does not always require the other person to change, sometimes it only requires releasing the weight of resentment. He returned to his work quietly, as he always had, not seeking attention or recognition. In every file, in every person who stood before the bench, Lucas saw familiar crossroads, and he always asked himself what Henry would have chosen as right. One evening, Lucas sat alone at the old chessboard, placed the first piece down, and allowed himself a faint smile. He understood that he was no longer the boy who had been left behind, nor merely the heir to an inheritance. He was the result of chosen love, of lessons paid for with an entire lifetime. If this story made you pause and reflect, leave a comment. If it touched something deeper within you, press like. And if you wish to continue walking alongside stories of justice, choice, and the human heart, subscribe. Your support is the reason these stories continue to be told.